Well, hello everybody. Hope you had a great weekend and enjoyed the snow. I know I certainly did. I got out skiing this weekend, which is always a treat. We're going to go ahead and pick up where we left off on the recording last week, and we were kind of talking about high expectations and where students end up after they leave your school. So you may have personal experience or work experience around kind of knowing that sometimes our students with disabilities leave our schools and they are not engaged in any kind of meaningful employment or further education. And so I'm going to share actually some data with you around our students in Utah with disabilities and what they're doing a year after they leave school. So you may or may not be familiar with what's called the Post-School Outcomes Survey, also known as Indicator 14. But essentially what it is every single year, we attempt to contact every student that left their high school with an IEP in place, whether they left by graduating, dropping out, aging out at age 22, for example, or if they left with a certificate of completion. We call them a year after that and ask them a whole bunch of questions to kind of find out, what have they been engaged in that year they've been out of school. So we specifically want to know at what level they've been employed, if they're going on to further education and training, college, for example, or any other kinds of training, and what level of independent living, or if they are connected with other agencies and support. So that is our post-school outcome survey in a nutshell. But I wanted to kind of, give you guys some information around what does that look like, right, for our students. So this summer, we interviewed our students that left in 2022, and only 18% of all students that had IEPs in place went on to a 2 or 4 year high school. So that's down a couple percentage points from last year. But I have to say, over the last 7 years that I've been at the State Board of Education, that hasn't changed a lot. So we're seeing pretty low rates of our students with disabilities going on to 2 or 4 year colleges. Then our students that are competitively employed, and that means that they're earning at least minimum wage or higher. They're working 90 days at least throughout that whole year and about 20 hours a week average. We have about 58% of our students overall that are former students overall that are competitively employed. And then there's 23% that are engaged in some other kind of education and training. So that could look like, a tech college, or certificate for nursing, for example, or a welding certificate, or even students that go on missions are actually counted there. So another 23% are doing that. And then 14 are engaged in some other employment. And what that means is maybe they're self-employed, or maybe they were employed for 90 days, but they're not meeting that 20-hour-a-week criteria. So maybe they're working 10 hours a week, for example. But the last data point here, 16% of our students that left a year ago are not engaged in any kind of meaningful employment or post-secondary education, right? So that's a little more than 1 out of 10 students that are not engaged in something. So that's probably the most kind of upsetting number, I think. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper. Those were all students with disabilities that had an IEP in place, right? All the disability categories, the whole range. But now let's look more carefully or closely at our students with autism. So 1 year after leaving high school, 46% of students with autism had worked for at least 3 months. So that's less than half of our students with autism actually had worked in that year. And 35% said they were not employed due to health or disability related issues. I know that's kind of vague, but I wonder sometimes if, that just means that maybe they just didn't connect to the right services, or, we didn't really prepare them well for employment because they essentially said that their disability was the barrier to employment, which we believe should not be the barrier to employment, right? We can support and mitigate and prepare students with disabilities for employment. But this last data point, 26%, so over a quarter of our students with autism were not engaged in any kind of further education and training. And that makes me sad, right? So are they just sitting at home in their parents' basement playing video games? We don't know exactly what they're doing, but they're not meaningfully engaged. So just wanted to give you some perspective. And this was a study that was done in 2015, but I still think this really is important to point out that we know from the research that if students have paid employment while they're in high school or while they're still in school, they are much more likely to have that. So this study showed that 90% of youth with autism that had jobs during school also had those jobs into their early 20s, compared to only 40% of those who did not have work in high school. So it's just so important that we make sure that students have work experiences while they're still in schools. So this is really just to kind of get an idea of, what are your thoughts around this? Do you have questions? Are you shocked by the data? Do you already kind of know that? And certainly if you want to answer that at all in our discussion, you can do that. But I just wanted you to ponder that. So what gives, us our lives, what gives purpose and significance to your life, right? And I think that is really no different than for a student with a complex need. So what makes life meaningful for us? I mean, it's usually most of these things on this list, but certainly employment, not just the money, but the self-worth and feeling like you're part of something with your place of employment, friends and family and community, your health, you may have children, all of these things, freedom and independence to make choices and being valued. That's really what makes, I think, our lives meaningful. And it really shouldn't be any different for our students with complex needs. So kind of keeping that in mind in the context of transition planning for our students with more complex needs that might not be able to voice some of these things, right, with verbal language. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have high expectations. And so we don't want to get stuck in this kind of status quo. Oh, the student has this label, or they have a complex need, or they don't use verbal communication. Therefore, they don't have a lot of options, right? In life. I think we need to really flip that and say it's not really what they bring to the table, but it's how we set that table. We don't know, how a student might do in a certain setting until we get them into that setting. And so I think we should never kind of write students off based on labels or what it looks like they might be able to accomplish. So high expectations, I think, is something we all need to keep in mind. And parents oftentimes look to us as professionals for what those high expectations, what might be possible. And if we are already kind of saying that there are barriers or students can't do things, then, parents are going to have lower expectations. So that's something to keep in mind. So how do we improve these outcomes for our students that we just kind of shared? I put together a Padlet, and this is on the Padlet link that I put in the Canvas, which was kind of the Padlet to all Padlets. And I know that was probably overwhelming because there's tons of them, but there is one specific to transition planning for students with complex needs you could take a look at. And I'm going to share some of those things that are on that Padlet in this presentation today. So just quickly, what does the law say about transition? And this may be a review for you, so I'll kind of go through it quickly. But we know in Utah that we have to begin transition planning with students at age 14. And nationally or federally, that age is 16, but Utah starts when the student is 14. There must be a transition plan in place. The student must be invited to that IEP where transition services are going to be discussed. And we want more than just the student invite. We really want students being active participants, but we'll kind of get into that more when we talk about student-led IEPs. And then what we're going to talk about today really is the importance of transition assessments. And there must be transition assessments that were conducted prior to the development of that transition IEP meeting. And then, of course, out of that, we develop transition goals, post-secondary goals, and those targeted services. And they must be based on a student's strengths, interests, preferences, and needs. And that's really the whole reason we do transition assessment, is because we want to draw those things out. We want to figure out, what are students' strengths? What are their preferences? What are their interests? And what are their needs in the context of transition needs, not just academic needs. So we'll get into more depth about that. But I love this cartoon. You may or may not have seen this before, but I talk to a lot of parents oftentimes in the summer after that post-school outcome survey, and they'll say things like, it always was on my son's transition plan to go to college, but then he went the first semester and he didn't know how to talk about his disability or ask for accommodations. He was shy, he was uncomfortable, and he failed his first test, and now he won't come out of his room. And so I think we as educators really have to anticipate what are the demands of those post-school settings, right? Whether that be college or employment, and how do we anticipate that? How do we sort of build some perseverance, some resilience, some skills that students have before they get in those settings before they leave our schools? So keep that in mind as you're building the transition plan. We really have to kind of figure out, what are some of those gaps? Are they around self-determination, self-advocacy? Is it, behavior that's going to get in the way? Is it self-regulation? Is it lack of experience out, in the community, for example? So really kind of anticipating what are, some of the barriers or some of the pitfalls that students are going to hit when they get out in the world. And how do we help them prepare for that by really meaningfully kind of planning the transition plan out to try to, help them with some of those things that they might encounter after they leave school, because school is a very protective place to be. And then once students leave, it's a lot different out there, right? So I really like this flow chart. So we want to stress that the transition plan is not just a page in the IEP to check a bunch of boxes and say that you did it, but it really is a process, and it's a powerful process, I think, if it's done well and correctly. So we start at the top with making sure that we have meaningful student participation in this whole process, whatever that might look like for a student. With a student with a more complex need, that might look different, but we still want students to be part of their IEP, part of their planning, have voice, choice, those kinds of things, and also be involved in those transition assessments. So that is the starting point really of a compliant and quality transition plan, is this orange box here, age appropriate transition assessments, where we're really trying to get to know the student and figure out what it is that their strengths, interests, preferences, and needs are, and so that we can develop an appropriate plan for them. So that is our starting point. This is probably really hard to see, and I apologize, but this is essentially what the transition plan looks like in our state model plan. So when you work in your LEAs, you're probably, working on an online IEP platform. Maybe it's Embrace, or maybe it's another one, but essentially all of the components of that post-secondary plan will be in your that IEP platform embedded. But I wanted you to just see what the model form looks like, and there are links to it as well later on. But we start again from this place of transition assessments. So you may or may not be familiar with the Career Development and Transition Division. It's a division of CEC, the Council for Exceptional Children, which you may already be a member of as a student. But DCDT puts out just, kind of all the latest research and lots of practical information around transition. So if you get an opportunity to become a member of DCDT, I'd highly recommend it. But they define transition assessment as an ongoing process of collecting data on the individual's needs, preferences, interests as they relate to the demands of the current and future working, educational, living, and personal and social environments, right? So that's a lot. So essentially what that's saying is that transition assessment isn't a one and done. It is not a one size fits all. And I think especially for our students with complex needs, we really have to look at this as how do we gather this rich, information and data around this student's preference, interests, strengths, and needs, and then really make sure that we're anticipating what are the skills, what are the activities, exposure that they need, so that we can really prepare them well. That's our whole job, right? Is to prepare our students to do well when they leave us. It's not just about getting to the graduation or getting to 22s and then, and then the student is done with school. It's really like, is there this nice seamless transition to the rest of their life? And is it meaningful? That's kind of the goal. So we do that really first by making sure that we are addressing kind of all areas around transition assessment. So typically transition assessments fall under these 4 domains, right? Career interest assessments, and that is definitely a big part of it. And there's a ton out there. And some are appropriate for some students and other ones, not so much. I think for the purposes of our students with more complex needs, I'm going to share some with you that I think will be helpful. And then the second domain here is self-advocacy and self-determination. We miss this one a lot. We kind of forget that that's a really important part of transition, to assess the student's level of self-advocacy, you know, can they talk about their disability? Can they explain it? Do they know what they need help with? Do they know how to ask for accommodations? Those kinds of things. Are they determined? You know, can they make choices? Are they driving where they want their life to go? And then, of course, adult living skills. There's lots of different assessments around that. And I'm going to share with you some kind of really nice, simple ones today. And then college readiness. There's not a ton of those, but there are a few that they're typically checklists where students and educators and families can kind of check, you know, not so much do the students have the academics to navigate college, but all those other things, right? The executive functioning and problem solving and communicating and kind of all those skills that you need to be successful in college. So again, we've talked several times about this already, but if there's one, you know, takeaway you have today, I think it's to remember that acronym SPINS. Anytime we start transition planning with a student, we have to ask ourselves, you know, do we have information or do we need to gather more information around what their strengths, their preferences, their interests, and their needs in the context of transition. I'm not going to have you all do this. This was an activity, but since we're not live, we'll skip that for a moment. But how do you know, I get this question a lot, like, how do you choose appropriate transition assessments? And I went through this as a teacher. I was in a district where I was kind of handed one transition questionnaire, and I just felt like it didn't really match the population I worked with. It just wasn't a good tool for my students with more complex needs. So I went searching. I just searched a lot of different transition assessments. And, you know, you might be lucky in that you're in a school that has kind of a nice toolkit that's already laid out for you, that the district likes certain transition assessments. They might share those with you and you can kind of pick from those. If not, then you really want to make sure that you are aware of what's out there and how to get access to those. There's many that are free. The ones all on the Padlet and the ones I'm about to share with you are totally free. I definitely would start there. And you want to make sure that you know your student and can determine what's going to be the most helpful in really pulling out like what transition needs that they have, right? And we can only do that if we assess for things. So if we don't know if they need adult living skills, well, we better assess for it, right? If we don't know how what if they have self-advocacy skills, we have to assess for it. And there are different types of ways that you can do that. So we're going to go through that. I'd like to start with these guiding questions, right? So you're working with a student, maybe it's a new student, you ask yourself, you know, what are their unique talents and interests? If we haven't figured that out yet, then we want to make sure that we, you know, maybe talk with families or others that know them really well if we're not seeing some of that at school. What does the student want for their future? You know, we'd want to involve families in that question as well. Sometimes the students, what they want for their future doesn't align with the parents. So it's really important to have a conversation with both. When is the student and where are they at their best? And I call this conditions for employment. So here's an example. I had students who were not morning, you know, just didn't function well in the morning. And I just knew that I wasn't going to put that student at a work-based learning site, for example, in the morning because they needed the first 2 hours to wake up and they really weren't at their best. I had other students that after lunch just kind of fell apart, right? And so I knew that I really had to maximize their learning and their activities in the morning. So that's kind of what I mean by conditions. Same with loud places, busy places, quiet places, kind of just knowing where their students are at their best, I think, because then when it comes time for work-based learning experiences and matching them to employment environments, we know that about them. That's really important that we know their conditions. And then what are their options? I think sometimes students just simply don't know, and sometimes families simply don't know what's available, right? So now we have a whole bunch of college programs for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities like Aggie's Elevated. A lot of parents and students still don't know that that is an option that they can go to college. So making sure that they're aware of what's out there post high school, and then really zeroing in on what are some of their barriers. Is it mobility? Is it, you know, communication? Is it behavior? Is it stamina, right? Like what are those barriers and what are some things we can start to work on now so that they're more successful? And then what post-secondary transition skills does a student need to have a positive post-school outcome? So trying to anticipate, you know, what is needed in employment, for example. So what kinds of skills do we really have to teach them and allow them to practice? So these are some examples of assessments for students with complex needs. It's definitely not an end-all be-all list. There's a lot more out there. Again, I mentioned that I really like to start with kind of the simple ones and the free ones. So the first one here is called a positive personal profile. And I love this because a lot of times when we work with students with more complex needs, we get really stuck on what they can't do. And this flips it around, right? This is all about like what's positive about the student. And so this is really intended. I mean, I think you as an educator can fill some of this out if you can also interview a student, but I think it's best used when we get information back from the folks that know your student the best, right? Which is often parents or grandparents or siblings or neighbors. So that's a really useful tool, and you can send it out to all of those folks and get information around this idea of a positive personal profile. And then the next one is a life skills assessment tool. So that's kind of like that adult living skills, but I love this one because it's a very simple scale. I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. It's a one pager, and it's kind of like divided up into a few different areas, and it gives you an idea of, you know, what is the student's skill level in these certain areas, and then what do we need to work on. I think it really helps you identify annual goals for the student. Then there's another assessment called the personal preference indicator. So sometimes we have a hard time just deciphering what's an interest and what's a preference. So we talked a little bit about preferences like, you know, morning and evening, noisy and quiet, you know, working indoors or outdoors. So preferences is really about, again, kind of where are they at their best. And then there's another one called employment supports indicator. And I think this is really helpful for a student that is, you know, a little bit older, like the last few years of high school, maybe. And it really zeroes in on what kinds of supports might the student need in an employment setting. So that's a really nice one specifically for that. And then to address self-determination and self-advocacy is the ARC self-determination scale. And again, that's kind of assessing the student's level of choice making and decision making, and kind of driving, you know, their ability to do things on their own. And then also looking at, do they have opportunities to do that, or are their parents doing everything for them? I mean, I had students who's, you know, the parents would choose what they wore and what they ate and where they went, and they didn't know how to make choices because they were not given that opportunity. And so that's ARC self-determination skill kind of does a little bit of that. All right, so what does the positive personal profile do? It's divided into sections. I'll show you a screenshot in a minute, but essentially it really goes over, you know, what are some of the students' dreams and goals? What are their interests? What are their kind of unique talents? What might be their learning styles, challenges, values? What do they value the most? What are their dislikes? I mean, it's important to know their dislikes too. Environmental preferences. What does their support system look like? Because that's important. Once they leave school, you need to kind of know, you know, how much support they have. And then some creative solutions. So this is what this is just a small screenshot, but it kind of has these questions. So this is very simple to give to a parent or, you know, an adult sibling or something like that to help fill out. It just gives you more rich information about that student. Then that life skills assessment toolkit, this came from a program called WorkLink. This is really used to determine what a student needs to learn, right? So this really will let us know, again, what kinds of annual IEP goals that student really needs to work on. It's used to set those goals, and you can also use this to track progress. So in other words, this could be done at the beginning of the year or prior to an IEP, and then revisited maybe every 6 months, for example, every semester, once a year, to kind of see, has the student, you know, made some gains in some of these areas. And then for our students with really extensive support needs, there's one called the Life Skills Assessment Self-Reliance, which is also included on that Padlet. And so there we're kind of looking at, maybe the student isn't doing a lot of things independently, but they are partially participating in a lot of daily activities. Maybe they have really limited mobility, for example. So that would be a more appropriate assessment for them. So again, this is just a screenshot, just has a list of things. For example, you know, is the student able to buy their own groceries? And it's just a very simple scale, like never does this, rarely does this, sometimes, usually, and always. And it's divided up into 4 different sections, starting with that home health and safety, and then community, and there's communication, and then a few others on that assessment. So that I think is a really great one to start for adult living skills. And then the preference indicators, this tool is really to assist in planning with for a person with a developmental disability. It's a guide, really, not a checklist. So it kind of just has some questions and then some open boxes. But again, it's just more of that ongoing gathering of information around what the students' preferences might be. And they it kind of follows these different domains. So it talks about their favorite things, and it focuses on their feelings and maybe their relationships and their personal health issues. So it's a little more comprehensive than the positive personal profile because it has a lot more sections to it, but still simple to use. I used to use this a lot I'd have parents fill it out. Oftentimes I would send it home, or I do it on the phone if I didn't feel like the parent could navigate through it themselves, or I wasn't going to get it back. I would do it that way. Then I mentioned that there's that employment supports indicator. So this is really specifically looking at like a student with complex needs, what kinds of support they might require in a workplace setting. So, and it's divided up into domains around social supports, workplace supports, learning supports, and then their level of knowledge around the technology or what technology supports they might need. And this is kind of what that looks like. And these are all on that Padlet. And then that self-determination. So again, this looks at their ability to be autonomous in their decision-making and self-regulation, that total self-determination, psychological empowerment. This one's a little more lengthy, but I still feel like this is a really great tool if you feel like you really need to assess the student's level of all of these areas around self-determination. This is what this looks like too. It's essentially a checklist, and then it gives you information at the very end on how to score that. So a few more resources. The first one is our State Board of Education Post-Secondary Transition Assessment Padlet, and that is on, I put that link in Canvas. And then there's just a few others, and they're on there as well. The NTACT National Technical Assistance Center on Transition has an assessment toolkit also, so that's available to you. And then Ocali, that's out of Ohio, they have something called the Transition Assessments Quick Book. So I'll make sure that these slides are in the Canvas so you can have those links available to you if you want to look at more assessments. And so just quickly, some takeaways today around transition assessments is making sure that you use those guiding questions to really help kind of steer you in the right directions as to what assessments you may want to use with the student. You want to ask yourself if the assessments really helped you determine the student's spins. So after, maybe implementing an assessment, again, go back and say, did I really capture the student's strengths, preference, interests, and needs kind of in all of these areas? And then you want to summarize those students' spins. So, and use that information really to help develop appropriate post-secondary goals for the student, and then to determine the skills needed for the students' transition services. And we're going to kind of dive into those two things, the post-secondary goals and the transition services in a later date. But right now, those were just the transition assessment takeaways. So hopefully that helped you a little bit with transition assessments, and I hope you have a great week. And I'll see you next week. Actually, no, next week is spring break, so I'll see you the week after that. Take care.